really thrilled to welcome Ryan Rice, Kanien'kehá of Kahnawake, who's here all the way from Ontario, from Toronto. Ryan Rice is a curator, critic, and creative consultant. His curatorial career spans 30 years in community, museums, artist-run centers, public spaces, and galleries. Rice focuses his extensive curatorial research and writing on contemporary and Onkwehón art. He has been published in numerous periodicals, journals, and exhibition catalogues, including Rendezvous with the Indigenous Art Collection, How to Raise a Flag in Curating Lively Objects, Bait, Couzyn Van Heuvelen, and Freefall, the Photography of Shelley Niro for Shelley Niro Scotiabank Award. In 2022, he presented 3 solo exhibitions: Jordan Bennett Souvenir at On-Site Gallery, Pageant Natalie King at Center 3, and Versification January Rogers at Daphne Art Center, and advanced 2 public art commissions as the Indigenous Public Art Curator and with Waterfront Toronto. He received the 2022 Changemakers BIPOC Award from Galleries Ontario, Ontario Galleries, recognizing his contributions to community leadership and organizational experience, which includes co-founder of the Aboriginal Indigenous Curatorial Collective, the Inuit Art Foundation Board, and an advisory member of Longhouse Labs. He is the executive director of OCAD University's On-Site Gallery, in addition to his 2021 appointment as its curator, Indigenous Art. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Rice.
What Gunuaradu, Segu Sewo Guego, Arunyanas Yojets. Very excited to be here today. One of the things I highlight in my bio recently is 2022, which included 3 solo exhibitions and 2 public art commissions that were $1 million each, because that was during the pandemic. It was one of the busiest times in my creative career during the pandemic that I was able to do things from home, from afar, but also to build these very important projects underneath the rubric of a solo exhibition. So for years, many Indigenous people have always been collected within group exhibitions. So solo exhibitions are quite significant as we move forward in the art and culture sector. So firstly, I want to acknowledge the Wampanoag as the original rights holders of this territory we are gathered on today, with hopes that their histories are not forgotten by the land. I want to thank the Provincetown Art Association and Museum for selecting my abstract and symposium, and to those reviewers, those 3 reviewers who were mentioned earlier. I also want to thank Ruby T for the hospitality and all the arrangements to get me here, and my fellow presenters and panelists that are part of the symposium. So in my presentation, I will reflect upon my own lived experiences addressing and attending to the 3 Ps, what I call the 3 Ps: placemaking, placekeeping, and placetaking, which I have identified as a vital tool to amplify and advance Indigenous sovereignty, jurisdiction, and critical relationships to place, land, and water. While placemaking as a concept and a plan of action has gained popularity in the realm of city infrastructure with public art and urban planning capable of bringing context to a location, Indigenous communities have a long history of establishing their cultural and spiritual values in and to places they live and or are from. Those activities have been disrupted over time, but recent cultural shifts have led to new opportunities for exploring and establishing the 3 Ps through an Indigenous lens, which I approach from several vantage points, and in particular, a robust professional relationship to the land, and through the public art sector as a consultant, curator, artist, juror, and as a rights holder. I will offer some insight and context with hopes this will generate a conversation and some questions around the 3 Ps afterwards. So I'm not going to give you a didactic definition of what these are, but I'll give you more examples of how I identify this. Land is a living archive, the ultimate metadata that feeds signifiers of physical traces, evolution, cultural biodiversity, held in nature, and it can be interpreted by faith and knowledge keepers who carry forward the philosophical underpinnings instituted from a diversity of indigenous traditional knowledge and worldview. These readings prompt the question, what can the land tell us? For the Haudenosaunee, who are the Six Nations Confederacy, the Ahanta Gariwadekwa, which is the opening address, or what we call the words before all else, this provides the foundation of understanding sustenance, environmental concerns, lived experiences, and fundamental knowledge we require to be present, connected, and responsible as stewards to the land. It starts with acknowledgement and gratitude. This image here is by Megan Sams, Mi'kmaq artist, whose work, titled A Gentle Reminder from 2023, was one artwork that was part of the 2023 Buena Vista Biennale, which I curated, and it took shape through the aspirations and conceptual framework of the theme host. My co-curator, Rose Boutelier, and I assembled 23 artists to explore the concept host through its many meanings grounded to a relationship with the land and water. Host socially implies the receiving of a guest with expectations of generosity as well as reciprocity. In ecology, it describes interspecies relations, which can be mutual beneficial or parasitic. Host spoke to the deep histories of place and invited visitors to explore how people, perspectives, life forms, and locations meet and relate to one another. We have a duty, a responsibility, teasing out muted, neglected, and elapsed land-based narratives that we understand or translate as memory, influence, and concretize the foundational scholarship across many intellectual fields, which includes art, and addresses a society's evolution and progression. Historians, ethnographers, archivists, economists, urban planners, engineers, and sociologists are among a whole slew of Western-based scholars and specialists who excavate, map, interpret, and build a past to consider and imagine society's present and future. Contributing research informs curiosity and expands one's capacity to experience place and the world. However, such experience in the Americas as a significant colonial project has been limited for centuries to a predisposition that champions a monotheistic memory. Recounting a historical precedent through a lens of creativity to recuperate the memory of the land and spirit forgotten can enable our imagination to acknowledge relationships to place and to each other. To do so, deep contemplation needs to be enacted. Active listening, looking, and self-reflection need to be withstood and confirmed. Building on forensic capacity of what research can offer, curatorial and creative practices can dig deeper to render, recount, and counter, or disrupt memory to expand myths ascribed onto sites on the land to further substantiate and bear witness to time immemorial. For my evolving research around land and relationships, I referenced the City of Toronto's Garrison Creek, the Fort York National Historical Sites in situ ensconced linear timeline as an example that is monumentalized in steel and concrete like a surveyor's rule. The Public Art Design commissioned work runs along the park's eastern perimeter lower staircase, flowing upwards to a bustling Bathurst street. And this troubles me and needs troubling. I just drove by here the other day. It's full of graffiti, but it's a space that leads to nowhere. It's supposed to lead to the fort, but they have barricaded that area, so it's become a homeless camp and also a graffiti wall. So not many people are experiencing what this wall has to do. So this embellished weighted display enforces the dates of the cultural tenancy by indigenous nations, rendered generic, so there's no specificity of who was on the land, as well as the British and French colonial settlers. This outlines a span of approximately 13,000 years. So that's what this is a timeline to show you this span of 13,000 years on this concrete. Aside from a small portion that focuses on 400 years of place-taking, detailing colonial history that can be framed in the urban setting as land that is treated as urbs nullius, in the language of Indigenous scholar Glenn Coulthard, as, quote, places devoid of Indigenous presence and sovereignty. An enormous gap accounting for 12,600 years plus is cited and minimized in the illustrated timeline and is void of any milestones within an elapsed span of 10 millennia. This recognition lacks any historical indicators measured across the gigantic fragment of chronological sequence that does little to serve a wholesome understanding of place beyond the sliver that historicizes and celebrates settler occupation and carries forward the nation-state narrative of occupation. The absence of any historical significance is frankly lazy and detrimental to understanding this land's particular characteristics. Fort York is a romanticized marker. It commemorates the War of 1812. Yet the disparaging manicured sight of consequential violence and glory conflates time to relish in a particular moment of imperialism and battle over the significant origins of the Garrison Creek shoreline ecosystems that have been removed from memory and altered indefinitely. It also supports the erasure of Indigenous occupation, mobilization, and commerce over time well into the present. The indiscernible animal and human-born crisscrossing routes at this site chronicles the changing topography that is increasingly forgotten unless we prod the memory the land holds. The memory is waiting to be stirred, awakened, and encountered. It cites a significant aspect of myth to be celebrated and presence to be mapped and remapped onto the vague linear timeline currently offered that inspires the resuscitation, cultivation, and activation of overlooked and neglected histories. By reading and referencing what the land will tell us and will become useful and at times critical for the future of politics, planning, and place keeping. Given a city such as Toronto, or even here a town in Provincetown, historical precedent is scattered and heavily embedded within the colonial framework that began in a not-so-distant past. So when I say not-so-distant past, when you look at that timeline of 13,000 years, settler relationships only exist within the last 500 plus, so it's a very small moment in time. Through a colonial lens, poured concrete forts, bricks, glass, and high steel structures, which are now defined as heritage, even though cities are relatively new spaces. American and Canadian colonial history is consistent with burying the origins of place. An example that I did a project in the past was the Montreal Hochelaga, where it was critical for the narrative to identify that Indigenous people weren't from there, or they just disappeared, to clear the land for access for newcomers. And this continues to uphold and support the consistent practice of ghosting Indigenous presence from its territories, aside from the recent land acknowledgement practices and protocols that are taking place today, which causes injury through our absence as well as our obscure presence. Where are we? So in this slide, I share a few photos of a makeshift monument, a DIY marker, a canvas for an artist, a graffiti artist, of a transformed boulder excavated from Kahnawake land that is a discarded remnant of the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is my community, Kahnawake, where I was born and raised. The St. Lawrence Seaway, which was hailed as a 1950s engineering marvel constructed between 1954 and 1959, and runs approximately 15 kilometers through government-expropriated Kahnawake reserve lands in my community. This marker is not a commemoration of the Seaway's realization, nor its achievement celebrated in Canada, US, and internationally. Yet it was and can be recognized as a tangible place-making sculpture, public art, or monument, demarcating the land significantly between the 1960s through to the 1990s for us. Us being Kahnawake Rono, those people who are standing by the rock, and at the same time for the thousands of South Shore suburban commuters trespassing through Kahnawake to reach the island, the city of Montreal. The rock holds critical memory, a placeholder like a mnemonic device, wampum, or a city street sign. Until recently, Kahnawake was a place where the streets had no name, and it is activated through the creative process by an artist to distinguish the place it claims and embodies. So this is Kahnawake, which is 6 miles away from downtown Montreal. It's located in Quebec. It's a reservation, currently with a population of about 10,000 Mohawk people. You'll see the St. Lawrence River to the top, the St. Lawrence Seaway in the middle, which cuts through the community's land and access to the river. Kahnawake means by the rapids. So we were displaced to a different space. The seaway cut right through there and severed our identity with the place that we call home. So the rock was disturbed, displaced from its original place, like many households in the community, which were along that path of the seaway, who were forced to relocate from the engineered path of the seaway. The rock was a monument of sovereignty and pride, a defiant entity we, community members, stood with. It marked a new era when a revitalization of tradition was being reclaimed to counter a legislative path of assimilation well into the 1960s. It acted as a symbol of identity. The rock's presence, that monument, invited us to feel secure on our lands. The message was loud and clear. You have entered a different space that was not yours, essentially reminding, warning, informing the public to keep on going. So you'll see there is the major international seaway that goes through, there's a major international railway that goes through, there's 3 arteries of major highways that go through. So Kahnawake is trespassed because the reservation is supposed to be the homelands of Indigenous people, but it's a throughway to get to the city. It's a main artery, as well as the sky path to go over. The airport is just right across the river. So the community has significantly felt the encroachment of non-Indigenous people throughout their occupation here in Kahnawake. Kahnawake is originally from upstate New York and near the Albany area and moved over time from the 1600s to this location in the late 1800s. The other thing I thought I would give a quick tidbit of historical knowledge about Kahnawake is we do have a relationship in Massachusetts. We are the people known as the ones who incited the Deerfield Massacre. So if you know that historical event, it was my community, Kahnawake, who came to that territory. We're also known as steelworkers, high construction steelworkers, ironworkers, and in the early 1930s, there was 30-something men died on the collapse of the Quebec Bridge, which was called the Quebec Bridge disaster. And it reminded me of the markers that we place in our community to commemorate things and that have gone forgotten. So at each end of the community, there are steel crosses to commemorate that horrific event. But they also took the steel from the bridge to build these crosses as well as the headstones for all the men who died in the collapse of the bridge. So in the mid-1990s, the rock was knocked over by a vehicle and since has vanished. A new one appeared in recent years, heeding a more specific call: you are on Mohawk land. Through the process of embodied mapping and sharing contemporary narratives of lived experiences, inventing urban myths, and tracing urban migrations, our communities can symbolically reclaim the origins of place. In this case, and for this paper, I focused research to where I currently work and live in Toronto, which is an Indigenous place. Toronto isn't translated from the Mohawk word Tsitakaranto or Aderodu, which is traditional Iroquoian rooted words meaning where the trees are standing in the water. This definition significantly shifts the commonly understood gathering place interpretation popularized by the 19th century historian Henry Skading. So it's interesting how people impose their own stories and have become sort of like what I call the myths of place. And, you know, I know that there is a myth here, there is a colonial narrative here, there's a colonial narrative in Bona Vista of a landfall as well by John Cabot. So these stories became embedded into the identity of place. In Bona Vista, they don't even know if it's true, but they say we're going to hang on to that story. So it's interesting how things stories are being told and being capitalized. So the nomics encoded in the linguistic jurisdiction recognize indigenous visual and oral languages have the power to contribute to visualizing place and provide additional inspiration to decolonize and navigate the land, as Michelle has shown us in her artwork. We can draw from the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which is a significant example of visual metaphor coded through a wampum belt, also evidence of our rich relationships with people from this area, because the wampum is a significant of value within our political structure in more northeast. And it speaks to our historical and contemporary relationships within the shared territories. In the process of strengthening localized relationships, walking, living, being, present, looking, activating senses, digging deep into the historical relationships of where you stand, unanswered questions become apparent. Question 1, how do we negotiate knowing and understanding where we are? And question 2, how do we interact and uncover what was historically excluded, yet perpetually exists in parallel to mainstream society? And that is inclusive in arts and culture, whether it is presented in artworks, monuments, exhibitions, collections, archives, and publications. When I talk to my students and we think about land and place, I like to use the analogy of how many of you go traveling? How many of you do research before you go on an international trip? How many books do you read? How much research do you understand about the origins of place? That doesn't happen here in the Americas. People are looking for the attraction. What's the attraction? So not many people understand the significance of place and the long histories that have been established. Those stories are sort of a blip on a screen or a introduction to a book. So as a creative form of disruption and intervention in response to these questions, I proposed a curatorial investigation titled #LIWYFTTG, which stands for Land is Where Your Feet Touch the Ground. And I came to think of this research that began in 2014 and 2015 with the overall goal to develop a contemporary visual literacy to place through personal and collective mappings animated from lived experience, expression present within the urban center of Toronto. Within an urban structure, people don't think of land. People think of land as somewhere else. People in New York go to the Hamptons. People in New York go to upstate New York. People in Toronto go to the Muskokas. I'm going to the land. So Indigenous people start adopting that ideology as well, even though they've been rooted in urban spaces for quite a long time. And it's like, I want to go back to the land, but we have to reimagine what the land is the place that we're living on. So part of this project was to rethink that land is where we are. We're always standing on land as a grounding foundation. So the possibilities obtained by teasing out Indigenous narratives in urban spaces and institutions affords land-based opportunities to exist and flourish on the ground we share as a means to symbolically reclaim relationship as a form of re-territorialization of land and place keeping. A precursor to this journey that this research project that I worked on was influenced by my relationship to understanding Haudenosaunee histories and a collaborative project with now Columbia anthropology professor Audra Simpson. In 1998, we were invited by artist Melanie Printup Hope and Shelley Niro to participate in an artist residency in Albany, New York area called Exploring Old Territories in New Ways. Audra and I framed the residency as a road trip, an opportunity for us to go home, recognizing home geographically, spiritually, and metaphorically, since to understand Mohawks, you must understand metaphor. And as a quote, a place of tradition, change, history, growth, and migration for us means Mohawk territory of Kahnawake and the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, New York, which is an extension of Kahnawake diaspora. We expanded home to encompass the extent of the Mohawk Nation's landscape as our traditional land base to experience a worn path, a route well-traveled. The residency's goals were to revisit landmarks and physical spaces integral to Iroquoian history in the Albany region. What we experienced on this path, quote, worn from moccasins driven by travel, trade, and warfare, are now paved with asphalt, resorts, shopping malls, and outlet centers. The signs of our presence and or our absence that we were looking for would come in all forms of capitalist economies that were void of cultural influence. Spanning 7 days, we produced a work of art titled Here in the Middle, You Are Here, that became a documentation in the vein of a tourist information map and brochure board of our creative research, a travelogue to address place, space, time, tradition, nature, movement, and society. The signs we encountered and identified, which were captured with a Polaroid camera, were signifiers that anchored us to the familiarity and unfamiliarity of land as a construct we would take with us into the future to remember the past. The first holder in the window reads on the far left, Kahnawake Jotjage. Population 6,500 Mohawks in Kahnawake, 44,000 natives in Montreal. Home is where the heart is. Like a heart, our territory offers relentless support that we take for granted. It is for this reason that we are journeying south to a place where our people come from. Our trail is a contemporary version of the one that we took out of the valley centuries ago. We're referring to the Mohawk Valley. We will be guided by the signs and symbols of Indians that crowd the road along the way. We will take this trail of ironworkers and study the roadside. When we arrive in Albany, we will stop to walk through some of the places where history of the Six Nations unfolded. We will continue our journey and return only once we reach Brooklyn. We carry 2 weeks worth of provisions, shorts, t-shirts, cameras, a tape recorder, and cassettes. Audra says, I forgot my Iroquois books and maps. We tell each other that this doesn't matter. We will find our way. We do not need to be told who we are, where we are going, or what we will find when we get there. I have been particularly influenced and inspired by Rama First Nation artist Glenna Matush's painting, this one here, titled My Great-Grandfather, Chief Yellowhead, who's buried under McDonald's on Yonge Street in Toronto. This piece is from 1995 and has lived in my mind for more than 20 odd years. I curated a solo exhibition of Matush's work titled Requickening at the Carleton University Art Gallery around 2006. But this has become my compass to witness and navigate my experiences as I walk, explore, and imagine the placekeeping efforts required to recount memory of a city and cities. Matush's painting was painted in 1995 after contemplating her history and ancestral connection to the cosmopolitan environment of Toronto from the distance of her studio in Montreal. The work is a significant gesture to consider the layers that exist under our feet, just waiting to be uncovered and recovered. Matush reminds us that within the urban landscape, we are not removed from the land. Through her painting, we can recognize the possibilities of our access to the stories, memories, languages, and enduring relationships that exist between us and place. While Matush's painting continues to feed my curiosity to place, Kanien'kehá activist Terry Montour's blog, Red Indian Girl blog, has grounded me to Toronto. Terry blogged, quote, "The city is on Haudenosaunee land. The remains of our villages slumber beneath the streets of this city. To this day, when a new subdivision is built or a street is dug up, shards of pottery and our particular arrowheads keep surfacing. It is a reminder that this place is where we used to walk, where we sang and held our ceremonies and dreamt our waking reality into life. When this city dreams, it dreams in Mohawk. Even when it names itself Toronto, Zitagaronto, Aderodu, Ontario, Ontario, and Canada, all of these are Mohawk words. You speak Mohawk whenever you name this place as your home. You speak it and you don't even know that you do. The astuteness of these two creative inventions that I just shared, Matush and Montour's blog, guided me personally through the investigation for Land is Where Your Feet Touch the Ground and produced 3 projects. One is You're Welcome at Artspace Gallery, Overlay of the Land, which is a gumball machine sticker, and Listen to the Land, which was part of Nuit Blanche 2019 at Fort York. Nuit Blanche is a 12-hour, all-night art intervention that happens across the city. It happens in many cities. So it's small projects that are taking place within 12 hours. These curatorial investigations included Indigenous artists Aileen Cucci, Logan McDonald, Ange Loft, Vanessa Dion Fletcher, and Jason Berg. The projects formalized both collaborative and individual relationships to place and each other that were manifested and experienced through an exhibition, limited edition multiples, and a performance. For Your Welcome, a welcome mat, a rug that is placed on the floor in front of one's home, was repurposed by the artists. Berg, Loft, Dion Fletcher, and McDonald used it as a physical object, a canvas, and a metaphorical device to locate and thread narrative to place. The welcome mat was a matrix framed as a site of contemplation to address shared space, colonial effect, and to recounter personal collective relationships to the land. The standard size welcome mat, which in this case was from IKEA, became canvases for the artist to activate and construct and deconstruct as a means to engage with the discourses around land acknowledgement and protocols that recognize stewardship, ownership, and hints of hospitality. For Overlay of the Land, which is on the far left, Aileen Cucci produced stickers drawn from her series, The Acknowledgement Project, that comprised of interventions and installations focused on removing acknowledgements from their formal institutional settings to instead sticking the language into unexpected places and spaces. Both projects were about listening to, reimagining, and crafting the stories the land will tell us. And this project, Listen to the Land, was conceived and curated as an ephemeral event through the formation of an ad hoc collective called Placeholders, as an intercultural collaborative performance and multimedia presentation held back at Fort York, a site during the Dusk to Dawn edition of the Nuit Blanche 12-hour event on October 5th, 2019, to momentarily expose and restore remembrance of the origins, languages, and stories the land holds. The Placeholder Collective formally grew out of the previous collaboration and projects that were mentioned. Our diversity as an urban indigenous collective of creative makers, thinkers, and activists embodied the variance of experiences and cultural knowledges indigeneity offers. Collectively, we form and are from an obscured indigenous diaspora still wrestling with recognition peppered across Toronto and most urban spaces. And represent Lenape, Métis, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mi'kmaq nations. Our collective's name, Placeholders, was a play on words to address our relationship to land and language through our indigenous bodies, recognizing that we are an evolving community occupying the past, present, and future. We hold space within and across our generational span for ones who came before and ones who are yet to come. The philosophy, similar to the Haudenosaunee philosophical underpinnings of the seventh generation teachings, was intended to develop and ensure our work adhered to principles in accountability and strategic in creating space for acknowledgement and gratitude. in addition to leveraging ways that insert our collective visibility into colonial narratives that seem to dominate the urban and public landscapes. I'm going to jump forward because So we were drawn to the open possibilities of the open call that was part of the Nuit Blanche curatorial framework called destruction as a determined act of coloniality and a removal that suppressed and stifled any form of continuity that was established and informed by an indigenous presence from being experienced. Through the insertion and push of our creative capabilities, desires, and lived experiences, we would encounter and gesture to erase the destruction of settler heritage and conflict through an imagined reclamation and reconciliatory actions provoked by creation. So we projected multiple artist projects that had relationship to the research that they did in the Fort York area. This is a digital manipulation of the dish with one spoon wampum. We also had sound data being transferred, languages being played, and when the crowd was smaller, the projections was triggered by the size of the crowd. So the bigger the crowd, the faster the projections went. Listen to the Land was developed as an opportunity to upend the defining narrative significant to the establishment of Canada's identity as a nation within the War of 1812. And our creative intervention was intended to reinterpret and regain our physical, spiritual, and symbolic relationships to place through the 3 Ps, temporal yet impactful, and emphasize the custodial principles we are accountable to. We use the interrogation of this colonial site to gently mediate and excavate our own histories in connection with the landscape through actions of care to recover and uncover buried stories from the grounds below, despite what's buried deep in the sediment and sentiment of Toronto's colonial myths. One of the things that we weren't planning to do, but became an apparent symbol of destruction, was when we encountered the site and we witnessed a British flag flying in the Fort York area. We kept seeing the flag and the flagpole as a barrier to our curatorial proposition, and it provoked our collective motivations to interrogate the site further, which pushed us to insert a physical performative intervention to signal our 12-hour occupation of the site. Through a symbolic takeover, we enacted a flag-raising ceremony in the spirit of a changing of the guard action. So we had the Fort York people take down the British flag, and when we started at 7 p.m., the beginning of the Nuit Blanche event, we raised our flag, a significantly sized hand-sewn rendering of the dish with one spoon wampum, in an attempt to restore and commemorate the significance of our project and insert the territorial treaty back onto the land where it was rooted. The flag-raising ceremony began with placeholder representatives proclaiming the oral tellings of the dish with one spoon agreements through a megaphone and beat of our drums, recounting out loud the recorded written documentation offered centuries ago by the peacemaker. As a duty to recount her memory, we continue to listen to creation through our contemporary presence to counter and recover from the devastating effects of erasure. Implementing our bodies to place, we loudly say we are still here. Thank you.
That British flag, was it, do you know who put it up? And how did your own flag raising ceremony, what was the response to that? So, I mean, the flag was in a British space. So you're looking at the American Revolution, the War of 1812, what divided the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, because we always said we weren't going to side with either the British, the French, or they weren't Americans at the time. Our Confederacy got split up, in the Seneca and the Onondaga sided with the American side,
and the rest of the Confederacy sided with the British. So this space was still recognized as a British historical site. It wasn't Canada yet. So they fly the British flag there. So when we entered the site, and you go back to the timeline of 12,000 years, it's the British who are still occupying that space from a very limited perspective. So by putting up the Dish with One Spoon treaty as a flag, which this is a relationship between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, that represents that we have responsibilities to take care of the land, and then that we will share the territory. And this isn't limited to a small area of Toronto. It goes through the whole Great Lakes, all the way to the East Coast. So the Dish with One Spoon agreement was a significant agreement of the land and how we are going to be responsible. So by taking that symbol in a more contemporary way on a flag and using that idea of nation building, what a flag represents when you claim territory. So we wanted to reclaim that territory back for the Dish with One Spoon relationship agreement that significantly still impacts the spaces today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just, that was great. I have a question. It's sort of a general question about land acknowledgements and your response to the proliferation. And I won't say what I think, but I'd like to know what you think.
Yeah, land acknowledgements have, they trended up quite quickly. But I think, from my perspective, I think it's a really important starting point to address where you are. So when the question earlier was between land and place, the land acknowledgement is recognizing the rights holder of that land, that territory, versus the place that the British flag would take, right? So I think they're really critical to start understanding the history of where you're from. So where your land, where land touches the ground, what is the historical reference that settlers should know, new immigrants should know? Where are they? So that history needs to be expanded, and a land acknowledgement is sort of like a little key, and I say little key, to start thinking about where you are and to understanding what your relationship to that history is. Because Canadian and American history is very short, a short reference point to understand where you are, right? So I think that gives people the opportunity to start shifting it, and within an educational context, how do you bring that into your curriculum? How do you reference it within your institutional space? Is there diversity and equity? Is there Wampanoag people in this collection here? So starting to think of those relationships, it just can expand, right? And then the criticism is they become very shallow. They become shallow by the people who present it, right? It's if you just go up and say, we're standing under that, you can tell by their body language that it's something that they have to do rather than. And I always tell people that I give them the opportunity, the land acknowledgement gives them the opportunity to position themselves, their family, and their history, if they have to offer one, and what their relationship is. So I've seen it expand quite significantly to address generations of occupation within territory and or relationships. So it's rich in many ways to build heritage.
I'm traveling a little away from what you're talking about and asking, how do you feel about and what data is known about the combining of the Wampanoags with the settlers that came afterwards? What percentage has
the Wampanoag spread into the community?
Yeah, as a visitor here, I don't know that information. I
What
didn't
about
do-
Toronto?
In Toronto? Well, you have, we talked about, Michelle brought up overlay earlier. Overlay, you have to think of who settled in that territory, how many histories and cultures were in there. Over that 12,000 year span, you have many different nations that are occupying it. The most recent occupation is the one that people cling on to, which is why you have to go deeper, right? So when I'm doing public art consultation in Toronto, which has opened up a vast opportunity for all those nations to be recognized, you have to go through a whole axis of accountability with not just one nation, not just one tribe, but many different governments and sovereigns. So we're using the term rights holders now, even though technically they don't have the rights to the territory, but it recognizes the historical precedent of them occupying that territory and identifying it as their own. So Haudenosaunee, we have New York State all the way to the end of New York State into Canada. That's the territory. That's the historical territory. So that claim is there. The Anishinaabe have that. The Wendat have that, and people have mobilized and moved out of different spaces over time. So the data. I mean, Toronto is a major metropolitan city, and it has the largest Indigenous population in Canada. So there's over 70,000 Indigenous people in Toronto.
Okay, last question. Thank you.
Hi, I had a question about your 3 Ps, and like I'm just curious. I'm really interested when an artist kind of has a framework that they feel is important, especially when they're sharing it at the outset. So I'm interested how your 3 Ps, just sharing more about that, whether like what lineage you see that coming from, or how that's guided you, either in this presentation or more broadly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So shifting from curatorial practice within exhibition spaces and moving out into a broader public realm, urban planners, architects, park developers have been using that term placemaking as a word that guides them into making parks, bringing public art to reality, and then sort of like the ambitious or the inspiration is to create from placemaking, placekeeping, where the community is going to take care of whatever you build. The community has a relationship to a garden. The community has a relationship to the statue. It's the community's role to activate the whatever was made through the placemaking efforts. That doesn't always happen, right? That's wishful thinking in many ways, because if you say the Wampanoag now have to take care of this, there's no budget, there's no infrastructure, does anybody live near it? Is there a community by? So placekeeping is sort of like a lofty idea that goes further. And then by me entering this field, I constantly say there's one element missing, is the place taking. So that you have to recognize the place taking measure or the concept before you can replace or place make. So recognizing that historical precedent on who was there is important, because it's about responsibility, accountability, reciprocity, and when you want to start involving Indigenous peoples into the planning, you have to recognize their historical relationship to that place first. So if there's been absence, removal, how do you address that? Land acknowledgement is one way. People are now asking Indigenous artists to, conceive of land acknowledgements through art, sculpture, public gardens, parks. But non-Indigenous people don't have to go through that process, right? So on any project I'm working on, I say there needs to be consultation, community engagement for not just the indigenous artists to do that work, but for the non-indigenous artists to understand, because this is where instances of things going wrong happen. Representation done badly happen. So I'm trying to implement a structure where everyone has to go through sort of like a competency, cultural competency, understanding of the territories that they're working on or developing public art, parks, etc., as part of the process that they will go through with a competition, being selected. So it just gives it a richer experience, even if the work isn't related to the land or the territory or the history. It just gives a context of where it is, instead of an Italian artist putting up sculpture done. Right? There's a relationship that's created.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Ryan Rice, everybody.